In order to carry out foreign policy goals, it's not uncommon for a government to approach and use marginalized or opposition groups in another nation for their own ends. Normally, they will pick one which has much to gain and not much more to lose, or is relatively strong in numbers or capabilities and provide them with the means to wage an insurgency, in other words a civil war, in their own country, to gain their own goals from their government. This can last for years and is not done out of some moral feeling on the part of the foreign government. The aim is often to force things such as regime change or concessions in negotiations, or just to tie that government down for a long period. In that instance, the more the marginalized group fights and dies without winning, the better it is for the foreign government. And this policy of supporting marginalized or opposition groups really isn't new. This is exactly what the German government did during World War I in Ireland, at the outbreak of the Irish Revolution, what the French government did during the War of the Austrian Succession against the British government when they supported Scottish Highlanders in the mid-17th century, what the English government did by supporting Dutch rebels against the Spanish government in the 16th and 17th centuries, and what the German and Italian governments did when they supported Iraqi nationalists during the 1941 Anglo-Iraqi War. It's also what the American government did during the Gulf War by supporting rebellion in Iraq, except in their case, they ended up actually wanting the insurgents to lose. The Kurds are the largest ethnic group in the world without a nation, and both they and Iraqi Shiites were victims of genocides, oppression, mass murder, and legal discrimination by Saddam's neo-fascist regime. Being mostly situated in Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran, the Kurds are seen as a valuable ally for governments looking to exert pressure on one another by supporting Kurdish insurgents striving for independence, but never giving them enough to win. I think this is because, if they did, governments would no longer be able to use them for their own ends. Similarly, the Shiites offered another group, more specifically the Iranian government, a similar opportunity. From 1974 to 1975, the Iranian government provided Kurdish forces in their war against the Iraqi government with weapons and logistics so as to use that support as a bargaining tool to get territorial concessions from Iraq's regime. In return for territory, they'd stop supporting the insurgency. As soon as they got the concessions, the Kurds were no longer useful to them, and so they abruptly ended their support and Kurdish forces were defeated. During the 1980s, the Iranian government also supported Shiite groups and encouraged them to rebel against Saddam and even assassinate him. In 1990, the Iraqi regime invaded and occupied Kuwait. The US government was determined to not allow them to succeed in establishing a new status quo, for, as US President George H.W. Bush said to French President François Mitterrand, he now controls enough oil and financial assets to totally alter the geostrategic picture, affecting oil supplies and prices. Bush wanted to use sanctions to economically strangle the Iraqi regime and force them to withdraw from Kuwait, but neither he nor most of his allies were convinced that it would work and felt that military action would be needed. This posed a mountain of problems for a mountain of reasons. Not least was the Iraqi army's perceived capabilities. In 1990, it was not only the fourth largest in the world, but highly experienced after years of war against the Iranian regime. Far more experienced than most US soldiers, many of whom had never been to war before. Also, they had vast stocks of poisoned gas and biological weapons. From the US government's perspective, if the Iraqi military could cause enough casualties to the American military and fight them into a stalemate, which was the exact sort of war which the Iraqi army was used to, then it was possible that Saddam might actually win a conflict against them. But there were also downsides to winning. As Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev warned Bush in September 1990, if you must defeat his main forces in Iraq, that's an enormous conflict. If the region ceases to function, the economic consequences could be enormous. We would be in hell, all of us. If the region is destroyed, the heartland of the Arab world, they will turn against you. If Iraq's regime were defeated, it could have led to all sorts of consequences. For one thing, the oppressed and marginalized people of the country, the Kurds, the Shiites, the Assyrians, etc., might rebel. If they were successful, Saddam might not only fall from power, but Iraq itself might break up into multiple new nations. This was a highly unstable situation which no government wanted. Except maybe one. The Iranian regime had spent the better part of the past decade supporting opposition groups across the Middle East to increase their own regional influence, especially in Iraq, due to the fact that they were fighting a war and looking to destabilize the Iraqi dictatorship as a method of defeating them. The Iranian government was oppositional to Western governments, but also the governments of the Gulf states, which is why those governments all supported and allied with the Iraqi dictatorship in the 1980s, when it was at war with the Iranian dictatorship. But if Iraq began to split up, this would provide the Iranian regime with a great opportunity to expand their own power across the region. They would especially look to support Shiites in southern Iraq due to the shared religious beliefs. Success in this would completely rip up the balance of power which existed in the Middle East. The problem for coalition governments was to defeat Saddam's army, but not so much that Iraq itself ceased to be and the Iranian government became the main regional power. For that to be avoided, either Saddam had to remain in power or be replaced with someone the coalition governments could work with. Keeping Saddam in power might be better for coalition governments from a short-term stability standpoint, but who knew about the long term? Saddam had shown the coalition governments that as long as he remained in power, he would start wars, fund insurgent groups against them, stockpile weapons of mass destruction, and be a threat to the energy resources those governments relied on. From their perspective, it would be better for them if the Iraqi military led a coup against the dictator and replaced him with someone willing to negotiate. Not only would that remove the threat from Saddam, but would help them contain the influence of the Iranian government as well. So, one of the less openly stated war aims for the US government was the overthrow of Saddam by his own forces, something which they hoped would be done swiftly and not cause too much disruption inside Iraq or threaten to pull it apart. The US National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, urged this from August 3, 1990, a day after the Iraqi regime invaded Kuwait. Bush agreed and ordered the CIA to destabilize Saddam's position and have him removed from power. When the air war began, it was intended to target the civilian population's morale. The doctrine behind the operation, known as the Five Rings, had as one of its aims for bombing to destroy the morale of civilians, but not to kill them en masse. The aim was to cause such sufficient hardship on the population that the people become either unwilling or unable to support the war effort. The regime itself was also a target, with the campaign meant to render Saddam ineffective as a leader. Both of these aims in conjunction were partly intended to force internal regime change. To help ensure the process, the US and UK governments worked to foment uprising against Saddam. The logic seemingly behind this was that by causing so much internal strife and public anger against the regime, the military would feel compelled to step in to keep the country in one piece and then start negotiating with the coalition. Bush himself made this very clear in February 1991 after a month of bombing against Iraq. In two speeches about the war on the 15th, he proclaimed that there's another way for the bloodshed to stop, and that is for the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands, to force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside and to comply with the United Nations resolutions and then rejoin the family of peace-loving nations. Meanwhile, this message and its theme were being spread to the Iraqi military and the population. Iraqi commanders had to begin confiscating their troops' radios to stop them from hearing the broadcasts from the CIA-run Voice of Free Iraq radio station, as well as the US government's Voice of America station. SIS, the British government's secret intelligence service, or MI6, was also working on Voice of Free Iraq with the CIA, as well as helped smuggle cassette tapes inciting sedition into Iraq through Jordan and Turkey. Then, on February 24, 1991, the day Iraq and Kuwait were invaded by the coalition militaries, the Voice of Free Iraq broadcast a message from Salah Omar al-Ali, an Iraqi Ba'athist purged from the government by Saddam in 1972 to Iraqi citizens. Rise to save your homeland from the clutches of dictatorship. You have no option in order to survive and defend the homeland but to put an end to the dictator and his criminal gang. Stage a revolution now, before it is too late. Coalition propaganda targeting Iraqis' hatred of their dictator, as well as news from the massive military defeat as retreating soldiers poured back into Iraq cities, led to rebellion against Saddam, most prominently from the Shiites in the south and the Kurds in the north, but many other people too. Hundreds of Iraqi troops joined the rebellion, but, crucially for the US government, there was no military coup. This made the rebellions far more dangerous from their policy standpoint. If Saddam stayed in power and Iraq split up, it would only turn into a civil war, which might suck in other governments, and the Iranian government would exploit it to become the regional power of the Middle East, which the Saudi government was desperate to stop from happening. So, in a complete turnaround, the preservation of Saddam's regime now became the US government's aim. Most of the rebels were convinced by the CIA-SIS propaganda that the coalition armies would arrive to help them overthrow Saddam, but they never came. Instead, the sections of the Iraqi military loyal to the dictator began to wipe them out. US Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney was worried that the Iranian government would support the Shiite rebels. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Colin Powell said that our practical intention was to leave Baghdad enough power to survive as a threat to an Iran that remained bitterly hostile towards the United States. In the ceasefire negotiations, the US commander Norman Schwarzkopf allowed the Iraqi government to continue using military helicopters, and even agreed to them being armed. The reason, Schwarzkopf later stated, was part of his government's plan to leave the Iraqi government able to counter the Iranian government. Schwarzkopf also held a private talk with the senior Iraqi general at the negotiations, possibly to convince him of the necessity of a coup. This probably wouldn't have been a wholly new idea to a senior Iraqi commander. Some Iraqi military officers had allegedly approached US intelligence about a coup in March 1990, but the US government wasn't interested at that time. The Omani foreign minister, Yusuf bin Alawi bin Abdullah, argued to Bush back in August 1990 that the outcome of the Gulf War should ensure a return to a balance of power whereby the Iranian and Iraqi regimes acted as a counterweight to one another. Otherwise, all he could suggest to keep the region stable was for US forces to be stationed in it for an indefinite time. The US government knew that most of its Arab government allies would not have been willing to occupy Iraq, and the US government themselves didn't want to get bogged down in a possibly years-long counterinsurgency across the country. US troops were not allowed to assist the rebellion by giving them captured Iraqi military weapons, which was also to stop US troops being pulled into a civil war in Iraq. The Iraqi dictatorship defeated the rebellions in a month, causing a refugee crisis and committing mass murder. So, after urging a marginalized group to rise up against their government and promising them the means, the US government abandoned them to achieve its own foreign policy goals at their expense. Years later, US National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft was giving a news interview, and the subject of the rebellions came up. I frankly wish the uprisings hadn't happened. We clearly would have preferred a coup.